He stood taller than almost any man alive in Tolkien's writing, yet most of his story never makes it into the popular version. But why was he raised believing himself no one? Why did his sword nearly bear a different name? And why did Gondor once mistake its future king for a second Dark Lord? Picture the tallest person you've ever stood next to. Now add another half a foot to it. You're still not quite level with Aragorn's shoulder. That's not a movie exaggeration, and that's how Tolkien's own mind worked out in his final years of life. And it's just one of a dozen or so things about Aragorn that never make it into the popular version of his story. We'll get to the height, we'll get to why his sword was almost named something completely different, and why the common folk of Gondor once mistook him for a second Dark Lord. But none of that means anything until you understand how his story almost ended before it began on a hillside with an orc arrow when Aragorn was 2 years old. He was born on the 1st of March in the year 2931 of the Third Age, in the hidden valley of Rivendell, to Arathorn II and Gilraen. His father was chieftain of the Dunedain, last scattered remnant of the once great kingdom of Arnor, a line of kings without a kingdom, guarding the secrets of the North for 1,000 years, or even more. Who knows? Tolkien mentioned it explicitly. Anyway, 2 years after Aragorn's birth, Arathorn was killed by an orc arrow through the eye while riding with the sons of Elrond. He was 60 years old, very young by the standard of his blood. This becomes much clearer when Tolkien describes the moment himself in an early draft of The Heirs of Elendil, published in the Peoples of Middle-earth. Therefore Gilraen consented and was wedded to Arathorn. And it came to pass that, after 1 year, Arador was taken by trolls and slain in the Coldfells, and Arathorn became Lord of the Dunedain, and again, after 1 year, his wife bore a son, and he was named Aragorn. And Aragorn, being now the son of the heir of Isildur, went with his mother, and dwelt in the house of Elrond in Imladris, for such was the custom in that day. And Elrond had in his keeping the heirlooms of the Dunedain. In his boyhood, Arathorn also had been fostered in that house, and he was a friend of Elladan and Elrohir, the sons of Elrond, and often he went a-hunting with them. Now, you'd might expect what came next to be some kind of ceremony, a grieving people, a new chieftain proclaimed. Instead, Gilraen, wife of Arathorn II and mother of Aragorn, quietly took her son and fled to Rivendell, and Elrond took them both into his household. And here's where it gets strange. Elrond didn't just hide Aragorn from Sauron, he hid Aragorn from Aragorn. Now, you might ask, what do I mean by hide Aragorn from Aragorn? Let me answer that question. Something the movies never show. The boy was given a new name, Estel, the Sindarin word for hope. And for the next 18 years, he had no idea who he actually was. Not a ranger's son, not a hidden king. Just a young man growing up among elves, believing himself an ordinary ward of Elrond's house. The wise had good reason for the deception, because Sauron was actively hunting for the heir of Isildur, and a toddler with a name and a bloodline was a toddler who could be found. I think this is one of the stranger things people miss about Aragorn. We picture him carrying the weight of his crown his entire life, brooding under its pressure from childhood. He wasn't. For 18 years, he didn't even know the crown existed at all. And here's a detail that will really throw you off, if you only know Aragorn from the finished books. Before Tolkien settled on a tall, grim ranger of ancient blood, he tried something completely different. In the earliest drafts of the story, the ones his son Christopher later collected and published in the History of the Lord of the Rings, the character who meets the hobbits at Bree wasn't a man at all. He was a hobbit, and his name was Trotter. Tolkien's notes describe him plainly. He was a dark, rather lean hobbit, wears wooden shoes, and those wooden shoes weren't a fashion choice. They existed because, in that draft, Trotter had been captured in Moria and tortured by the Dark Lord, his feet mutilated in the dungeons of Mordor. Tolkien kept toying with who Trotter actually was, a disguised elf, a lost cousin of Bilbo's. At one point, literally named Peregrine Boffin. It took years of drafting before Trotter became Strider, and Strider became a man. the last heir of a fallen royal line, rather than a maimed hobbit wandering the wild. But Tolkien gives us a very different picture of how Trotter was first introduced to the hobbits in the early drafts of the Treason of Isengard. Sam and Pippin looked at it as Frodo opened it. Inside there was a small paper in Gandalf's hand. It said, "All that is gold does not glitter. All that is long does not last. All that is old does not wither. Not all that is over is past. This is to certify that the bearer is Aragorn, son of Celeborn, of the line of Isildur Elendil's son, known in Bree as Trotter, enemy of the Nine and friend of Gandalf." Frodo stared at the words in amazement. "Of the line of Elendil," he said, looking with awe at Trotter. "Then it belongs to you as much as to me, or more." But if you look closely at Aragorn's grim, watchful character, even in the final version, you can still feel a trace of that original wound. The suspicion, the weariness, the sense of a man who's already been through something, that grew out of a hobbit in wooden shoes, long before it belonged to a king. Let's get back to Estelle though, because his real coming of age is where the story actually opens up. In the year 2951, at 20 years old, Aragorn returned to Rivendell after adventuring with Elrond's sons, Elladan and Elrohir. Elrond looked at the young man in front of him, fair, capable, already showing the bearing of someone far greater than he knew, and decided it was time. That day, Elrond called him by his true name for the first time in his life. Along with it came the heirlooms of his house, the Ring of Barahir, a first-age relic marking an ancient friendship between elves and men, and the broken shards of Narsil, the sword that had cut the ring from Sauron's hand at the end of the Second Age. Notice what Elrond withheld, though. The scepter of Anúminas, the actual mark of Arnorian kingship, stayed locked away. Aragorn hadn't earned it yet. He wouldn't for another 68 years. The very next evening, still absorbing everything he just learned about himself, Aragorn walked alone into the woods at sunset and started singing. Although in the movies it was at midnight, in Tolkien's original work it was at sunset. Anyway, he was singing the Lay of Lúthien, the ancient song of the mortal man Beren and the immortal elf maiden Lúthien Tinuviel, the most famous love story of the First Age. And as he sang about a woman stepping out of the trees toward a mortal man, a woman stepped out of the trees toward him. Tolkien's own words for that moment are worth keeping intact, because paraphrasing them would flatten exactly what made it so uncanny. Aragorn stood there, thinking that he had strayed into a dream. He genuinely wondered whether his own singing had somehow conjured her. It hadn't. It was Arwen, Elrond's daughter, freshly returned from years in Lothlorien, and for one disorienting moment, Aragorn believed he was looking at Lúthien herself, walked out of legend and into Rivendell. If you think that's just a coincidence dressed up as poetry, you might be underselling how deliberately Tolkien built this. Aragorn's entire love story is a mirror of the First Age's greatest myth, a mortal man falling for an immortal woman who will have to give up everything to be with him. It happened to Beren and Lúthien. It was about to happen again. Elrond, who loved Aragorn as his son, still set a condition that was less a father's blessing, and more a warning wrapped in impossible terms. Arwen would marry no one less than the restored High King of both Gondor and Arnor, not a chieftain of a scattered people, a king of the reunited realm, a realm that hadn't existed as one kingdom in over 1,000 years. Aragorn's mother felt the weight of that condition more than anyone. Gilrain understood exactly what it meant for her son to fall in love with a woman he might spend decades chasing an impossible throne to deserve. And yet, before she died, she gave him a line of verse that stayed one of the most quietly devastating lines in the whole legendarium. In Sindarin, Onen I Estel Edain, Uchebin Estel Anim. Tolkien translated it himself. I gave hope to the Dunedain. I have kept no hope for myself. She had named her son Hope, handed that hope over to an entire scattered people, and had nothing left over for herself. So Aragorn had his name, his heirlooms, and an impossible love with an impossible price attached. What he didn't have was a kingdom, an army, or any proof that he was fit to rule one. That's what the next 30 years were for. From 2957 to 2980, Aragorn essentially disappeared from his own story. And when he became the 16th chieftain of the Dunedain in name, he spent almost none of that time acting like it. Instead, he rode south under a completely different identity. First, he served King Fengel of Rohan, Theoden's father, learning the Horse Lord's warfare from the inside. Then he moved on to Gondor, into the service of the steward Ecthelion II, under the name Thorongil, Eagle of the Star, a name earned by his speed, his sharp eyes, and the silver star he wore on his cloak. He simply appeared, fully formed, as the most capable captain Ecthelion had ever commanded, loved by the steward above all his other officers. We get the answer in Tolkien's own words via Robert Foster's canonical reference in The Complete Guide to Middle-earth. Aragorn then went off into the wild. For nearly 70 years, he fought against Sauron in many ways and learned the customs of various peoples until he was the hardiest and the wisest man of his time. During this period, Aragorn served in disguise, Fengel of Rohan and Ecthelion of Gondor. In Gondor, he was known as Thorongil because of the Star of the Rangers that he wore. His greatest feat there was a raid on Umbar in 2980, in which he destroyed a large part of the fleet of the Corsairs. In 2956, he met Gandalf, and the two became close friends. In 3017, after 13 years of intermittent searching at Gandalf's request, Aragorn captured Gollum. The next year, he met Frodo and his companions at Bree and helped them to get to Rivendell. Aragorn was one of the 9 companions and led the Fellowship after Gandalf fell in Khazad-dûm. Now you might assume that kind of rise would make him a hero to everyone in the city, but it didn't. Ecthelion's own son, Denethor, watched this mysterious outsider outshine him at every turn, and he didn't buy the mystery for a second. Most readings of the text agree Denethor worked out, or at least strongly suspected, exactly who Thorongil really was, and it curdled into something closer to a cold war than simple jealousy. Denethor was convinced that this stranger was scheming with the wizard Mithrandir, Gandalf, to eventually push the stewards aside and reclaim the throne for a northern bloodline nobody in Gondor had any reason to trust. And Thorongil didn't help his own case, at least not with Denethor. He kept warning Ecthelion against Saruman, the White Wizard of Isengard, decades before Saruman's betrayal became common knowledge. If there's a single thread running underneath every part of this, the hidden childhood, the false names, the 13-year hunt, the chosen death, even Arwen's lonely end, it's the meaning tucked inside the name Gilraen gave him before she knew any of it would come true. Estelle, hope. Not the easy kind, where things are expected to turn out fine. The harder kind, where you keep going because it's right, even when nothing promises you it'll work. If you'd like to see more videos diving deep into the world of The Lord of the Rings, there's a video on the left of your screen, and consider subscribing and leaving a like. It really helps small channels like this. Take care and be safe, and that's where we'll leave it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.